here. And first, I want to talk about why this is even important. Why is this idea of mature change leadership so critical? And that's really because of the VUCA world that we're living in. Many of you have probably heard this term before. If you're not familiar with it, it's a term that comes from the military to describe conditions of warfare, but they certainly apply to our business world and to organizational life. The level of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is only increasing over time. And that is really putting different demands on us in terms of what we need to do for leadership, in particular, those leading change. The level of complexity is only really increasing. There's so many things going on that it's increasingly difficult to directly correlate cause and effect. So no longer are we able to say, because we did this, this is happening. And we're certainly seeing some of these complexities now. Emergence of the remote and hybrid work environment, the trauma impact that we've had from pandemic that is still going on. We're looking at the Great Resignation right now, where we have a lot of employees that have reassessed what they want from their work or quitting their employment, many with no other job to go to. So our organizational lives are full of complexity and change, and organizations need their people to be constantly adapting and collaborating, innovating and changing and performing at their best. And this is what's really making organizational life more difficult to lead through. And this is evidenced by the research I'm showing here on this slide called the complexity crisis. This research comes from a firm by the name of Lectica. And what they have shown in their research in the for-profit world, the not-for-profit world, and in the government space is that the level of task demand that is being required in increasingly higher leadership levels is outpacing what those same leaders are able to bring to that. So what you can see here in this chart is that you have levels of management going from supervisor all the way up to senior level leaders. And the red line heading up from left to right shows the level of complexity or task demands of those levels that's being required of them. And what you should be noticing is the gap between the leadership level and the task demand and the level of complexity as the level of leadership goes up. So essentially, what it's saying is that the gap between what is needed to be successful and what leadership is able to bring to that is growing, the gap, and particularly growing more in the more senior we get in organizations. And our traditional approach to leadership development, and in particular, change leadership development, is insufficient. And of course, when leadership is not happening well, then change is not managed well, because all leaders are responsible for managing change in today's VUCA world. It's not any longer about having an outside consulting firm come in and take full responsibility to lead your change. It's that all leaders need to be managing change. And the costs that are associated with not managing change well is significant. And these costs are high. So in particular, I want to focus on the loss of valuable employees. Change initiatives introduce one of the highest risk factors for loss of key talent. It's one of the most vulnerable times in an organization that an organization can experience. And of course, we've talked a little bit about that, decreasing engagement. We have people that leave the company and there's talent wars going on. We experience productivity loss. We experience loss of customers and greater competition, because if we're not servicing the customers well, it opens the doors for competitors. So I want to ask in this session, with all of the knowledge we have today about how to implement change, all of the methodologies and processes that are out there, why do you think we are still experiencing such a high frequency of change implementation failure? Why do you think it's not happening well? And I'd be interested in some of your thoughts. If you want to go ahead and just type your thoughts in the chat box, I'd appreciate that. Why do you think that with all that we know, and there's a lot of good methodologies and processes out there, why are we still experiencing these change failures? So Matt is saying evolving definition of change discipline. Yep. Lack of transparent communication. Thanks, Catherine. Camilla, lack of integrity. Interesting. Kristen, sustained communications. Lack of understanding why the change is so important. Susie, arrogance of top leadership. Interesting. Maria, not reaching hearts and minds. Lack of listening to voice. I totally agree with all of these answers. And I will also submit that I think that at the core of why this continues to still happen is that leaders really are lacking the knowledge. They lack the knowledge of the critical role they play in leading change. They lack the knowledge of the fundamental change methods and processes, which is our traditional approaches to change management, such as like we need to do stakeholder analyses and communication planning and training and set up change networks and sponsorship. But even more important is the lack of knowledge that they have about what happens to the brains of people they are leading during change, how the brain perceives and processes change, and what can be done to enable our brains to work at their best during times of uncertainty. So when we look at the level of complexity that leaders are dealing with and what leaders are able to bring to the table, and when you look at what we've just discussed as to why change is not happening well, it's really essentially causing what I'm calling the change leadership development imperative. So we are finding that current change leadership efforts are needed to meet the level of complexity and lead the change that we're finding in organizations. And yet our traditional approaches to leading change is insufficient because our traditional approach to change management and change leadership is structured methodologies and process-based. It is not based in neuro-informed change leadership, which I'll explain to you shortly. And as you see on the slide, I have a quote here from Nick Petrie at the Center for Creative Leadership, and he says, most leaders already know what they should be doing, but what they lack is the knowledge, is the personal development to do it. So the case that I'm building for you here is that the world is increasingly VUCA, volatile, complex, uncertain, ambiguous. And what we're seeing is that the gap between what leaders need to bring to deal with that complexity and their ability to do it in its growing volume, especially the more senior that they get in organizations, and that our traditional approach to change management and change leadership is insufficient because it's focused on implementing change methodologies and processes and not on neuro-informed change leadership. So at this point, you're probably wondering, well, what is this neuro-informed change leadership? And I'm going to tell you. Neuro-informed change leadership, or the antidote to this VUCA environment that I'm describing to you, is the idea that, one, we are able to use scientific evidence to lead people through change and create mentally, physically, and emotionally safe workplaces that perform and flourish during complexity. Somebody's saying they can't see the slides. Is that the case for everybody?
No, I can see them.
Slide? Okay. Camilla, I think there's something going on maybe with your system. So going back to this, number one, we're able to use scientific evidence. Number two, we are able to use a neuroscience lens to better understand others' perspectives and what motivates them. Number three, we're able to use neuroscience to plan at the macro level, meaning across the organization, and on the micro level to help individuals plan their efforts for change. In other words, we plan change with the brain in mind at all levels. And number four, we are able to self-reflect to better our own behaviors and triggers to better own our own behaviors and triggers and be able to adjust to them increasingly in real time. So how does neuro-informed change leadership work? Well, a nice analogy for it is similar to a set of 3 gears that I'm showing here in our holistic change leader model, where the 3 gears of leadership, change management, and self-awareness are working together to create those critically important trust-filled relationships that are required between the leader and their direct report to truly realize effective change. And we can't skip any of these. All of these are needed. But the richness of this model is that it builds on what we've traditionally known before. We still leverage what we know about traditional change methods and processes and traditional leadership methods and skills. So in the leadership gear here, you see that the day-to-day change leader is performing the normal operational kinds of tasks, leading his or her team using various leadership skills to get things done in their organization while they're leading in complexity. And they are also leveraging their knowledge about change management, that there are core concepts about change that they need to understand, that change occurs in phases, that there are very good structured change methods and processes that work most effectively when neuroscience concepts are utilized. And of course, neuroscience is what we're going to take a deeper dive into in just a moment. And then finally, that in this volatile and uncertain environment that the holistic change leader is leading in, she or he is very clear on what they want their personal leadership legacy to be. They're very clear on what their leadership purpose is. They're very clear on their own values, beliefs, and they're also acutely aware of how his or her own behaviors impact their ability to build those required trust levels and are taking steps to develop in the areas in which they need to grow and develop. And this, the largest gear here of self-awareness, is the largest gear because it's so important and has so much important weight to it. You can have all of the other things, but if you don't have that self-awareness and emotional intelligence, you're not going to build the trust that is needed. So there's a lot of information in this model, but let's get to looking at the neuroformed aspects of it. So first, there are some foundational truths that need to be understood. And one of the first things a highly effective change leader understands is that managing change is not about implementing a new system or introducing a new culture. Those are just the triggering events that require us to manage the change. But that managing change is really about changing behavior. That's what's really at the core. And many leaders forget this principle. Yes, we get people ready to embrace and adopt something, which is why we work to manage the change. But at the end of the day, changing behavior is really about creating the situations or environments that facilitate people to make the personal decision to change their behavior. But how do we get people to make that personal decision to change their behavior? Think about it for yourselves. Think about a situation where you had to make a significant change. What was it about that situation that allowed you to do so? So some of you might be thinking, I didn't really have a choice in the matter. But some of you may be thinking, you know, in the end, the decision was a good decision for me to do for myself and for others. So typically people don't make personal decisions to change their behaviors unless, number one, there is so much pain that the payoff to stay in that place no longer outweighs moving forward. Or number two, there's some sense of safety and trust. Somebody has their back. Some environment conditions exist where people have the courage to then take and make that change because they feel safe and they trust whatever the situation is to help them make their change. And in organizations, the ability for employees to make that personal decision to change their behavior is directly related to the strength of the relationship between an individual and his or her direct change leader manager. People make decisions to change their behavior when they have a strong, trust-filled relationship with that direct leader. They'll run through walls for that leader no matter what the leader asks them to do. We can get compliance and command people to follow a change, but in that case, you really don't have the heart of the individual in it. And that really impacts the ability for us to be able to help the organization sustain the change. I think Maria mentioned this about not having the heart of individuals embedded in it. What we really want are the hearts and minds, or the brains, of people making the personal decision to change. And this is where being neuro-informed helps. Because when we understand the principles of how the brain works during change and what governs it, then it makes it easier to understand what drives our behavior and how those of us leading change can significantly influence people to make those personal decisions by using what we understand about the neuroscience of change. So to understand how the brain works during change, we need to understand the structure of the brain and how it develops. The first part of our brain, which is the oldest part of our brain, develops first, is the survival. This is the brain's most basic job and sole purpose is about helping us to survive and keep us alive at all costs. Development of this part of the brain happens between the ages of 0 and 13 years before it moves to develop other parts of the brain. And as I mentioned, its most basic job is keeping us alive. This is important to keep in mind, and you'll see how that as we move forward. Then around age 13, the brain changes direction in its development, and it starts developing the frontal and prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that ultimately ends up being where our executive functioning happens, our ability to make decisions, where we're planning, where we're making judgments about life and situations. All of that happens in the frontal and prefrontal part of our brain. And then at the same time, development is occurring in the midbrain and the limbic portion. So it's kind of going back and forth and developing these two pieces. This is the part of our brain where that emotional command center is, where we are doing meaning making for ourselves about things. Now, there's a magic potion that all of us need for our brains to develop in its most optimal way. And when I say optimal, that all three regions of the brain are active and equally interacting with each other. And that magic potion is human interaction. We were created to be in relationship with each other, and our brains are completely dependent upon this in order to develop optimally. Gretchen Schmelzer, who is a organizational psychologist at the Telio Institute here locally in the Philadelphia area, writes this: everything you know and understand about yourself and the world, you would have learned first through your first relationships. Let me say that again, because it's really important. Everything you know and understand about yourself and the world, you would have first learned through your first relationships, meaning that all of the deductions you make how you understand the world to operate, all of these conclusions first happened during the earliest years of your life, and we're surrounded by the relationships in your life. So in early childhood, between 0 and 3 years old, there's a lot of rapid development occurring where we have massive bursts of neurosynaptic connections developing. And these neurosynaptic connections are what allow us to receive and process information, what helps us experience and make meaning of things. But there's something else that is occurring with our brain as it moves from developing the survival mechanism to the free prefrontal cortex during the ages of 12 and 13. A sort of pruning process is occurring where the brain does a mini assessment and begins to determine what parts of the brain have been most utilized, what parts have received the most energy and attention, and that the parts of it that have been required to stay alive and live in its current environment. Research tells us that while our brain is 2% of our body, it uses 20% of our energy to function. And that because of this, it wants to conserve as much energy as it can so that it can devote its energy to what is really necessary. So based on what has been most used, the brain begins to atrophy in those areas that have not been utilized, similar to the way a muscle is developed, where our body puts less energy into the muscles you're not using and focuses on devoting energy towards those parts that are being used more. And so those synaptic connections that continue to be activated and get reinforced, those nerves and connections that are helping us associate an action or an experience and then having a response to it, they become myelinated or wrapped by proteins, and they literally become hardwired. Your experiences are becoming hardwired into your biology. And all of this has a significant effect and impact on your ability to lead and informs us in an intimate way on how to lead change. So let me continue sharing some more neuroscience facts about the brain with you. Neuroscience fact number 1. Our brains do not like change when it is feeling threatened or unsafe. And we know that change brings a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty. Remember, our brains are all about protecting us. And to do this, it does 2 things. 1, it looks to avoid threats. And 2, it seeks out rewards. And any significant organizational change is going to be seen by our brains as a threat to our safety. So acting on the fight or flight responses, the amygdalas get triggered and our cortisol hormone levels, which is our stress hormone, increases. And cortisol has the ability to use an off switch for certain areas that the brain is perceiving are not required right now in this moment to stay alive. So if you're very triggered or where your brain is perceiving extreme threat, then the cortisol infusion becomes greater and greater until the limbic, midbrain, and frontal brain stop acting and you kick into full survival mode. And all of you have had this experience where you go dumb when you can't think straight, when something is threatening you or creating some kind of fear. We all get really stupid sometimes. And this because this part of the brain, our survival, is in high activity and really trying to protect us. And it's automatic and it's in full control. Now, we are only built to withstand 20 to 25 minutes at a time of a full infusion of cortisol. Beyond that, the brain begins to adapt and become more capable of operating in a threatening environment. And that's important because it's working to protect us, and it wants to be on the defense and be ready to respond in that fight or flight mode. So we have said that change is personal. And we also know that people experience change through their own lenses. Remember, we said that everything you know and understand about yourself and the world, you would have learned first through your first relationships. Our past experiences have a major impact on how we perceive the present. And our brains are always subconsciously comparing the present with our past experience. Now imagine if the environment around you during those early years where your brain was in high development, imagine it is an environment where there's a constant threat, where one's physical or emotional safety is constantly being threatened and put in jeopardy on a daily basis. Then it's likely that the lens that the individual will experience change through will be one of full-on protection, and they will automatically go to the place of feeling threatened because they're hardwired that way, because they've been put into a place of being in a survival mode in their youth. So it certainly doesn't mean that no other parts of the brain were not developed, but it does mean that their hard wiring takes them immediately to the survival mode when they are threatened, because there's a permanent physical change in the brain when you've been in an environment full of stress. In the 1990s, there was a study conducted by the Center for Disease Control here in the States and Kaiser Permanente, which is also another large healthcare organization here in the States. The study was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study, and its original intent was to research whether physical illness and disease had any correlation with the living environments out of which the participants came. Environments where there was abuse, such as physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, where there were household challenges like alcohol or drug abuse, or any other kinds of neglect of some kind. And the research showed that 70% of the population had been exposed to at least one of these types of threats, and that 25% have been exposed to 4 or more of these types of threats. Let me say it again, 70% of the population had been exposed to at least one type of these threats, and 25% have been exposed to 4 or more of these types of threats. And this research continues today, and the statistics continue to be true today, and they're probably increasing because of the struggles our world is going through with mental health and violence and things like that. So what does all of this mean for us that are leading change? It means that we can expect that the organizations in which we are looking to implement change are filled with leaders and employees that carry these experiences with them into the environment. And that's because the nature of introducing threat and uncertainty that change brings, leaders and employees will be reacting to automatically protect themselves and are likely to be highly triggered. And we start seeing behaviors and responses like those that you see at the top of this picture. We become less resistant to stress and to emotions, particularly during long-term periods like we've had in the pandemic. And on the surface, what we see are a lot of symptoms of being threatened, like anger and frustration and lashing out. But what we really don't see are the root causes, the hurt, the shame, the fear of abandonment that comes with growing up in these environments that we've described. Now, these things may be not conscious to the person displaying the behaviors, but they are there. And that's why I have coined them the term the silent stakeholders. Because if these stakeholders are not being kept in mind when we are planning change, they will surprise us and come up out of nowhere and will work against what we're trying to accomplish when leading change. And they're occurring because that individual is not feeling safe and is working to protect themselves from whatever. And because they've been conditioned to defend and protect. And so when I hear my clients saying things like, oh, they're just resisting the change, I coach them towards reframing their thinking, because it's not the person that's resisting their change. It's their brains. Many people don't set out to purposely resist change, but at the core, they're just trying to protect themselves from something that they perceive as a threat. This is why implementing psychologically safe environments is so key when leading change, where we have workplaces where employees feel safe to show up without fear and take interpersonal risks, where they feel accepted and respected. So I want to make a couple of additional points here. We know that some people are much more able to cope with uncertainty than others. People who've been through a lot of change and have had a lot of successes and had a positive experience, they're going to be more able to easily adapt to some of the changes that we are working to incorporate. Some are more resilient. However, as neuro-informed change leaders, we can't ignore that not all are at the same resilience level. So we need to be aware. And I'm not suggesting that we all become therapists. It's not our job as change leaders to address what's happened in the past for these employees, but it is our job to be aware that these situations exist so that we can better be able to understand others' perspectives during change and be able to have elevated levels of empathy and compassion. So a few years back, when I began to notice that while I was using all of these traditional methods, change methods and processes with my clients that are just as critical, that the change successes that I was having and my clients were having could be a richer experience. We were starting to get susceptible to falling into that 70% change failure statistic. And those sustainable changes that we needed to be occurring were not. And I really began to look at some things. And one of the things I started looking at was at the leader direct report relationship and thinking about how crucial that relationship is to building the trust and the safe environments that are necessary for people to make those personal changes. And I also really had to take a long, hard look at my own behaviors and what was potentially getting in the way of me leading richer change leadership experiences, because I come from a background that was not safe. And it was it was impacting my own abilities to really effectively lead change and have compassion and empathy for those that were going through it. And when I really started taking a look and getting some of those things healed, quite frankly, it really released real change for me personally, and it's released change efforts, and my leadership and consulting firm has, my relationships with clients are much better. So that is neuroscience fact number one. At the core, when it feels unsafe and threatened. Neuroscience fact number two, our brains don't like change when they can't predict what's going to happen. And of course, in this VUCA world, there's not that predictability. We've talked about the uncertainty of it all. And again, it stems back to the brain trying to protect us. So it tries to predict what's going on in order to protect us. And it wants to be able to predict and make meaning of what's going on. So to show you how good your brain is at predicting and making sense, I want you to take a minute to read this paragraph. So chances are that even though the letters are all mixed up, you were able to read this paragraph because of the nature of prediction that your brain has learned to accommodate. But during change, our brains can't predict what's going to happen. So our brains don't know what to make of it. So an example of this is somebody with Huntington's disease, which is a really traumatic disease that can cause physical decline and brain damage. And there's no cure to it, and its progress can't be reversed. But research has shown that those who have had the test for it, whether it proves positive whether it proves negative or positive, actually feel better. Their scores for depression are lower and their sense of well-being scores are higher because the uncertainty of it is gone. Now they can start making meaning of it and start planning for it. But if we don't have the story or the certainty of things, it's uncomfortable for us. So being certain removes the psychological discomfort. Certainty is rewarding to our brains. And when we find certainty, dopamine gets released in our brains, which is our feel-good hormones. So when our brain can't predict what the ending is going to be, it becomes more threatened. And the aroused amygdala means that we become more anxious and our brain starts to feel overwhelmed and fuzzy. And uncertainty distorts our view, and we begin to see threats in the workplace as greater than they really are. We begin to see our colleagues as a threat. We begin to see everything as a threat, and decision making becomes more difficult because we can't think clearly. And our memory and our ability to process new ideas and new information is reduced, and we're less able to focus on the present. And unfortunately, this is happening at a time where we really need people in our organizations to be thinking at their best, and yet their minds are distracted. So this is a really important message for those of us leading change. If people are struggling with change, it's not a sign that they're weak or failing in some way. It's just that their brains don't like change because number one, they're trying to protect themselves. And number two, they can't predict what the ending is. And of course, in our VUCA world now, there's no time to really predict what's going to happen because by the time we start to beginning to get an inclination of what might be happening, the next change is coming along. And so it's this vicious cycle. So that's neuroscience fact number 2. Neuroscience fact number 3, our brains don't like change when it's taking too much time to figure something out. I mentioned earlier that our brains really look for ways to conserve energy and find ways to take shortcuts. And this can be helpful for us. I mean, not every decision do we need to intimately think through things, but sometimes bad decisions can be made too quickly because the brain isn't wanting to stay in this place of uncertainty. So during change, decision-making can be particularly difficult because there's often so much uncertainty around it, which then brings a threat, which then causes a bad decision, and a bad decision can make the change initiative go off the rails. So think about what's happening in our organizations right now in this pandemic state. Organizations are wrestling with whether they make the decision to have everybody return to the workplace or allowing them to work from home. And some are demanding that all of the employees return to the workplace, while others are saying we're going completely virtual. And the point is that a lot of these final decisions may be getting made because of the urge to try to return to some sort of normalcy, and because the brains are not liking being in this uncertain place that doesn't seem to have any end to it, and it feels like it's taking too much time. But the problem is that some of these decisions could be good and some of these could be bad, and some of these decisions that are being made are having significant backlash for companies because they've got employees resigning that are trying to find work in other environments that better suit them. So knowing all of these things that we talked about, what can we do as change leaders to counteract these unproductive, distracted states? What can we do to help minimize the threat and fear states? Because after all, we still need people in our organizations to be able to think and perform. The brain power of our employees is all we have in most of our organizations today. So I know that there are a lot of experienced people on this discussion with us today, and I do want to give you a chance to share some of your ideas or hacks that we can do to help with this. And we're going to go into some breakouts. But before we do, let me share one additional piece of insurance that will help inform that discussion. And that research has to do with how we perform. So what you're looking at here is the inverted U of performance. This model was put in place in 1908 by two psychologists by the name of Robert Yerkes and John Dodson. And this model has been further investigated in recent years and is really standing the test of time. The y-axis shows the ability of the brain to stay focused. And at the bottom, you see it's very distracted and disorganized. And at the top, it's very focused and organized. Along the x-axis, along the bottom, is the level of stress the brain is under, or the level of arousal. On the top part of the U, upside down U, the brain is sharp and performing well. And if you see on the left-hand side of the U, inverted U, the brain is unfocused. And over on the right-hand side of the U, the brain is not performing well either. And the Yerkes-Dodson Law states that there is a relationship between the level of arousal and our ability to perform a task. In other words, there's an optimal level of arousal, but too much arousal or too little reduces our ability to perform the task well. And you all have experienced this. You all know you have days when you feel like you're in the zone. You're at the top of that inverted U. Things that you're undertaking are effortless. It just seems to be flowing. But equally, we have all felt those days where we just couldn't get motivated for what we had to do. And those kinds of days are the result of too little arousal. Or on the right-hand side of the U, where you feel you can't get motivated, it's because of too much stress, feeling overwhelmed and things like that. And if it looks like that state is going to keep up for a while, say during periods of change or pandemic, or you're taking care of a sick parent or whatever it is, the brain becomes really frazzled and things feel out of control and overwhelming. So when we are in this zone of optimal performance, we are getting rewarded and we are in the flow, and dopamine, our reward hormone, is excreted. And as we are feeling more rewarded, more dopamine is increased. And dopamine is a chemical in our brain that is now being linked to parts of the brain, we believe, that help us acquire new behaviors. So it is associated with rewards. If we're getting rewarded, dopamine helps us to acquire new behaviors. And as we've said, successful change management is about getting people to change their behavior and make those personal decisions to do so. So you can see the connection here. And the keys, the criteria here to being in the zone is having a challenge that captures one's attention, having the skills to meet that challenge, and then when accomplishing it, getting immediate feedback on how we're doing, which then gives us a positive feeling, which then motivates us to want to do more. So neuroscience fact number 4 is our brains don't like change when they're pushed too hard. Understimulation and too little pressure leads us to be distracted, as we see here on the left-hand side of the U. Overstimulation leads us to finding it hard to think, as on the right-hand side of the U. And as you can obviously see the obvious negative implications for organizations when employee expectations are not met, or when employees are not receiving recognitions and rewards, or when they are. And of course, those rewards don't have to always be monetary. So reduced dopamine levels reduces our desire to do anything significant, which then lowers our mental performance, but increased dopamine levels will drive us to do something else that releases more dopamine in our systems. So I know I've given you a whole lot of information, lots to think about. And now that we've kind of learned a little bit of these facts, and by the way, there are plenty more facts. There's a lot more about neuroscience. This field is an amazingly rich, filled, and growing field. And I've just given you a taste of things. But now that we have learned a little bit more, let's talk about how we can help people, how we can come up with some hacks that will help organizations and change leaders, work to help make environments feel more safe, work to help increase some sense of predictability, work to sustain commitment and help levels during long periods of uncertainty, and work to increase those levels of performance. So before I go into breakouts, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and see questions or comments. Again, I know I've given you a lot and I've been talking at you for a while, but that we're going to go into breakout. So any questions or comments? Denise, I do see that you have, yes, I will be sending out the recording for this session afterwards.
Oh, thank you, Tricia. I've been taking notes like a fiend, but I've missed so much.
That's okay. No worries. Other questions or comments? You can do it out loud. We have a small group. You can write in the chat. I wasn't that good, guys. Maybe none of this has been new for any of you. Maybe you've learned a little bit different perspective. Nothing?
I have one comment. This is Denise.
Sure.
And I apologize for being off camera. Today's not a camera ready day.
That's okay.
It's so interesting where you were talking about the neuro connection to resistance, because you do see quite often where we'll say that a certain demographic within the organization is resistant, and very often what you see is we take a bigger shovel, we take a bigger hammer, we take a bigger push to make sure that, well, maybe we're just not communicating it hard enough, and so we aren't really pulling back and saying, well, what's going on with them to make them resistant?
Yeah.
And even beyond that, are there certain loud voices within the group that might have something going on even more deeply, but they're an influential voice?
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You're inviting us to peel the onion, and that's beautiful.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Tricia, I also had a comment. One of the, I'm thinking about us getting, how do we get deeper?
Maria, sorry, you cut out. Say again.
How do we get deeper into that beneath the surface stuff of people? So you had the picture, the cartoon of the girl, and then you had the underneath the surface, what we don't see. Mm-hmm. I think in an environment, whether it be corporate or any kind of organization, it's difficult to get that personal with the person in order to find that out. So that's where I always struggle.
Yes, and that's why I mentioned, our job here is not to be therapists. It's more understand that there might be some of this going on a deeper level. Not that you necessarily need to address it, but just being savvy about it and realizing that it might be there might help formulate a different kind of question. You're not going to dig into the person's past necessarily and find out what may have happened or not happened, but the symptoms and the degrees of the symptoms that are being displayed might be connected to something deeper. But it's not about trying to dig in. It's to Denise's point, what might really be going here. Okay, so they're trying to really protect themselves. They may not even be aware that they have some of these things. It's not like people have done, many people in life haven't really looked at how their past is contributing to how they react in day-to-day work life today. But it does help us to just understand that some of this might be going on, and it might help shape some of the questions. Does that make sense, Maria?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Tricia.
Yeah, go ahead.
To dovetail on both of those comments. When I was looking at the last slide, I was thinking that transparency could be the answer for at least 3/4 of those, some increased level of transparency. And then in terms of predictability, on a wider level, if you just establish some kind of honest, frequent group-wide communication, that also could be very helpful in my mind.
Yes.
And like you said, I've had managers, I absolutely would run through walls for today. I would do it today. I haven't seen them in forever. So, people don't quit companies, they quit managers.
So
Part of the-
Trisha,
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry
Matt.
to interrupt.
No worries. Go ahead.
The one thing the last slide taught me was that I'd really love to see in the future some research on which interventions, which hacks result in the most effective change process and under what conditions, which types of changes. So when which are used, how do they have the best?
Right. Are you talking about this slide, Matt, or are you talking about this slide?
That one, yes.
Yeah.
What makes it safe? What makes it predictable?
So what we're going to do at this point is to go into breakouts. I think I'll probably we have about 10 people here. Maybe we'll do about four or five of them so that you have a partner to talk about. Because what I wanted you all to do, and I have some ideas about hacks, but I know we have a lot of experienced people on this in this call with us in this webinar. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to think about what are some of the hacks that you have used or could potentially use to help with these areas. So I'm encouraging you to take a screenshot of this particular slide so that you have this to refer to when you go into your breakouts. I'm just going to do a random breakout. We're at 12:28 now. I was thinking to give you about 15 minutes, but maybe we'll go about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll come back and talk about it in a large group, Matt, and you probably will hear at that point some hacks that people use and have been successful with in the past. So before I do that, any questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, so exactly on your question, actually. I had a question just how I relate this also exercise, the hack ideas. Do I relate it to the last slide where you showed the inverted view of performance, so that basically these hacks also help to stay in this perfect simulation of change also, and that we reach high performance so that we stay in this perfect level of stimulation. And that's kind of connected, right?
Yes, yes. So if you look at what's on the screen, kind of I've addressed making it feel safe. If you go back to all the brain facts that I gave, brains don't like change when they don't feel safe. So what can we do to help people feel safer? They don't like it when they can't predict things. Well, what can we do to help increase that sense of predictability? We're never going to have final predictability in the VUCA world, but there are things that we can do to kind of help make it feel a little bit more predictable. The commitment levels, when it doesn't like uncertainty, people start to wean and get their commitment levels go away. And this last piece about performance, there's probably things we can do to help increase those levels of performance that we talked about in that last slide, Nina. So that's what use all four of these. And again, it's not going to be perfect. It's just going to be perfect, but we all have, because really, if everybody knew what to do, they wouldn't need us.
No, exactly. I just find the connection very interesting, because not having predictability means that it's more stress. So it's related to the inverted view, in order that it's less performance.
Yes.
So no, I just thought I comment and also have the question that it's all very much connected.
Yes, it is. Yeah, thank you. All right, so let me go ahead and put you into these breakouts, and I will give you a 1-minute warning. Again, I'm thinking 10 to 12 minutes. If you need more time, we can always talk about things in the larger group when we come back together. And I think that probably some of the hacks that all of you will be coming back with are some of the hacks that I have in mind too. So, all right, let me go ahead and break you out. Some of this time I'm kind of giving you a chance to introduce yourselves a little bit. So, all right then. All right, so let's just kind of go into, since we're a smaller group, we have the luxury here of just kind of calling out. I don't necessarily need to do a round robin on a large group debrief. So what were things that you came up with as ideas for hacks? And then, yeah, so I'm not going to necessarily put them on the screen or anything, but interested. So who's got something to share? And if you want, you can also use the chat room too. But
our team talked about a bunch of different things, but one of the things on commitment was to involve people along the way. So let them know what what the end is, what it's going to look like, and then keeping the stakeholders involved along the way. So not just town halls, but letting the employees and people being affected by the change take part. I think it was Kristen that said she used, put it up on a whiteboard and let all of the people say what the wins were, what wasn't, how they're feeling about things.
Awesome.
And then one of the other things was rewards and recognition along the way to keep people committed.
Great. And yeah, those the reward piece will help with that sense of performance, acknowledging achievements and things. The wins really do help people get that sense of feeling like maybe this isn't as unsafe or as threatening as I thought it would be. That sounds like a great. Kristen, how did that work when you had them documenting what the wins were?
And I was saying in our group that I won't take credit for the idea, but I was impressed with it because it was a group of pretty jaded people about what was happening in the organization. And when the question was asked, like, hey, let's just think of some small things that have gotten better, and all of a sudden that momentum builds. And next thing you know, there were 25 or whatever, things listed, both large and small. So I thought that just, asking the question, what is one positive? And if each person at a table can think of one thing, you're going to have some overlap, but when you add that up, it really created a really nice momentum and a positive energy in the room to then be able to talk about other things that needed to happen in the organization.
Yeah, and then when you get those long periods of where it just feels like you're in purgatory forever, those really help with that commitment to Maria's point. Great. Other conversations, other hacks.
We were just two people in our room,
Okay.
and we talked more about, okay, what are methods, like, for example, a roadmap or a change architecture, using that to really plan the change, because everything that happens in the change should be planned beforehand, rather than going live and then you really have an issue with resistance and overwhelming and not feeling safe because you're put into this change all of a sudden. So kind of the same as some people said before here, transparency, as well as like this roadmap for everyone to be visible and to take action in different parts of or the process and the change. But I found something very interesting, that also Camilla, I hope I say this name correctly, said was, if we would use these methods always in a proper way, and if the leaders were also willing to use these methods, we probably wouldn't have this issue. But like often it's the issue that the leaders do not take these methods at hand and like do not give all the information as transparent as they could actually. So it's a different type of problem that we approach then, because we have enough methods, as you said also before, in order to address address this?
Yes, the methods are good. They're strong. I would say, though, that understanding a little bit how the brain is working, perceiving during change and everything. In other words, the understanding how the brain, what the brain needs, and all of some of the things that I shared with, the methods can help meet those needs of the brain. But the problem I see is that we rely only on the methods and we don't understand how it impacts the brain. And that's where I think we are lacking in our discipline. So that's why I'm really excited about this particular and passionate about it, because it changes the whole perspective. It takes it from being a touchy-feely kind of thing, oh, change management, to there's a very real science why we do this. So great, Nina, thanks. Other comments or questions? Or other things that people came up with?
Just going to say, Tricia, based on those tools and things that the previous speaker just talked about, one of the things are the change assessments. When you go in and you do the change assessment, that could give you a lot of insight into how people are thinking and even feeling. So to me, if that's one of a really good tool. But our team came up with in predictability. One of the things they said was to keep educating the stakeholders and keep informing them and get feedback. And that was very helpful. And I liked that. So that hit home with me.
Matt and Susie, did you have anything? Are you still with us? Susie is, yeah. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, one thing we talked about, Susie described the opportunity that, unwittingly she was able to give the impacted stakeholders the opportunity to vent. It wasn't pretty, but they needed that chance to express how they felt. And I know for me, coming from a background in learning and development, I found that providing support, making it clear that the impacted stakeholders will have everything they need and all the support they need to execute on the new future state.
Right. Takes away that feeling of threat, and information always helps people feel like, well, we talked about that uncertainty that comes along. That does help. But feeling just those feelings, expressing those feelings, as Susie said, is helpful. And it does actually address some of those underlying things that we talked about in that one slide, even though it may not be, really on the conscious mind. Maria, one thing I was thinking about your question before the breakout about this slide and how we get to this underneath. I would submit that it's not so much about getting to the underneath here, being aware for the employees, but I look at this more like us as change leaders. We need to be really in touch with our own stuff and our own behaviors that might be coming out, and what might be going on for us because of that whole nature of the need for well-being in the organization, and that we're leading to some degree. We do kind of play the organizational psychologist. So that's where I really shared more about this on a personal level when I began to really understand what was driving. I think it impacts us as leaders, and we're talking about leaders that we want to be much more vulnerable, be open, be emotionally intelligent, and understand their own emotions. A lot of this has to do with understanding the root genesis for where our emotions are coming from. So let me share with all of you some of my thoughts on hacks, and because I know we're kind of getting close to time here. A lot of these probably are not going to be new to you. Information, obviously, several of you talked about having roadmaps and communications, obviously very important as far as, helping people take away that feeling of unpredictability, or being a little bit more certain, and getting people involved in co-creating their changes. Remember, oftentimes leaders have had much longer time to sit with the information before they actually roll it out, and then they scratch their heads why people aren't getting on board as quickly. Well, people need time to make sense of it for themselves. So that regular cadence of communication to increase performance, help people set short-term goals. Long-term goals that go on forever will not feed that need for the dopamine in our systems to get those short-term goals, have something to achieve, create and celebrate it, acknowledge the wins, which then create a desire to continue doing more. Praise and recognition, particularly when is unexpected, really helps with that. It allows for more innovation and creativity. Building those relationships, as I mentioned, that trust relationship, I really believe that the vertex, that relationship between leader and direct report, is really the vertex of where that shift and change happens. And those of us that are leaders, to what I was just mentioning, the more aware we are of our own emotions and what generates them, and are taking action to really resolve and grow ourselves, the better we're going to be able to do to have these open relationships and trusting relationships. I talked about achievements already. Laughter, got to co-create those times of laughter, because that again creates that dopamine and sense of feeling rewarded, and just having laughter, having teams get together. One research study out of Warwick University showed that just by making people happy, whether it was making them laugh or watching a comedy or giving them chocolate, actually increased productivity by 12%. We need to really get to the place of helping people shift their minds about stuff. And we're excited about what's going on in neuroplasticity today, because we are finding where we used to think the brain stopped developing at 25 years old. That's no longer the case. We actually do have the ability to stretch and learn and keep our minds growing if we're really intentional about it. Find new things, novelty, which help the brain get stimulated and have that challenge that we talked about. Maybe even a new meeting space, or having a meeting that has no agenda at all, but just to listen to each other. We talked about praise and recognition already. And then a key thing, as I mentioned, it's about self-reflecting, really looking as change leaders at our own triggers and our own feelings about change. What triggers us? What are the actions that you might be taking that are breaking down that trust in teams? And if we aren't willing to admit that we're in an ongoing learning ourselves as change leaders, then we're not going to gain the trust of our employees, and change is not going to happen in general. So I want to thank all of you for your participation today. That's really bringing us to the end of what I was hoping to cover today. Thanks for your ideas. I did want to share with you some additional resources if you are interested. So I did talk about the Adverse Childhood Experience Test. You can go to the CDC, Center for Disease Control .gov, and you can learn a little bit more about that test and what the actual questions are that are asked. I also mentioned that I had written an article called I mentioned about silent stakeholders. Well, I have written an article called The Silent Stakeholders that you can obtain on my web at transformstrat.blog on transformstrat.com/blog. You can get a copy of it there. It has also been recently published in Change Management Review magazine, as well as a podcast being done with Change Management Review about this topic of trauma. I wanted to let all of you know I actually happen to be the co-country lead for Change Management Institute, which is an organization that is actually started in Australia, but I'm part of helping lead the US chapter. And the Change Management Institute is a great organization because not only is it's just filled with research and white papers, and some of the finest minds in change management actually are contributing If you want to join us, we're having a change chat here in the US on the 7th of January about this topic of neuroscience and how it is impacting how we lead change. And then finally, if you're interested, I'm going to be starting next year a monthly virtual facilitated networking session for change management practitioners. If you're interested in being a part of that and would like to receive an invitation for that, very unstructured. It's just facilitated networking session, breakouts and things, just to learn about others that are in the field and network. So all of these things are available to you. I will send the recording of this out to all of you who attended today. Thanks again so much for attending. Any closing questions or thoughts? I know we're right at time here. Well, I hope you all have a great rest of your year and a good holiday season. And thanks again for attending. And at this point, we will call it a wrap. Take care.